Tamam, tekrar kayda başladık. Bu 4. kayıt oluyor galiba. Öyle geçmiş olayım. Bugün Balinese bakalım dedim ama dün Relative Clause'lara girince ya o zaman Türkçe'ye de bakalım oldum biraz. Ee, Aslında özet olarak şöyle bir yerdeyiz gibi. Yani case categorical bu şu anlamda argümansa şu, bunu şuna çevirmek ya da şuna çevirmek şu verbal subcategorization olduğu için şu da bu anlamda kategori. Yani bu higher order function'lar tamamen first order function'lardan derive ediliyor. Başka hiçbir yerden derive edilmiyor. Bu anlamda kategori yok. Böyle devam edince grammatical relation cross category oluyor. Yani şöyle düşünün. Mesela Cirbal'de şöyle bir şey vardı. Control verb absolutive değil mi? Böyle bir şeydi. Yargı ondan mı vardı? Yanlış yapmış olmayayım. Yani absolutive bir VP alıyor. Bunun anlamı şuydu. Yani öyle bir tanımla başlamıştım ben. Missing argümanı absolutive olmak zorunda. Dolayısıyla absolutive yani case morforisi ergatif olan bir dilde subject of IV, object of TV olduğu için cross categorial şu. Ama cross categorial ilişkiyi gene bir kategorinin içinde capture ediyorsunuz. Dolayısıyla bu hikaye hani en baştan beri hikaye şu ya, her şeyi kategoriyle çözeceğim. Yani böyle linking teori olmayacak, şu olmayacak, bu olmayacak ki her şey local ve grammatical olsun. Gramer tamamen transparent olsun, correspondence'larla ilgili. Bu gramerin transparency'sinin modellemeye de ilişkisi olduğunu düşünüyorum ben. Yani grameri ne kadar transparent yaparsan, language acquisition, computation modelini falan yapacaksan o kadar modellemeye açık oluyor sonuçta. Çünkü ne kadar extra grammatical principle varsa o kadar computation karışmaya başlıyor açıkçası. Yani bu hepimizin programlama yapmış herkesin derinden hissettiği bir şeydir zaten. Yani dolayısıyla transparency yani cross categorial bir şeyi transparent hale getirmenin yolunu görünce bu cross categorial şeyler de iş yapıyor diyebiliriz. Çünkü bu tip kategoriler sayesinde typoloji de kategoriyel olmaya başlıyor. Yani typolojiyi mesela Neumayer'ın şöyle bunu dönem başında Ümit Hoca çok güzel özetlemişti. Neumayer'ın şöyle bir genellemesi var. Fritz Neumayer diye biliyorum. Fritz Neumayer. Yazım iyice bozulmaya başladı. kalem ise başka dert. Kalem iyice alsa başka da bu sefer de yazım kötüleşmeye var.
Evet. 2013 diye hatırlıyorum ama tekrar bakarım.
3 tane linguistik pozisyon var. Bunları açık etmek lazım demiştim. Bir tanesi universalism. Ee, Bundan kastı hani sonuçta bir teorik, bir gramerle ilgili teorik, empirik herhangi bir şey söyleyecekseniz bütün insan gramerleriyle ilgili bir şey söylemiyorsanız hani bunun çok fazla bir enteresyonu yok. Yani theory of English, theory of Turkish olmaz demeye getiriyor ki %100 haklı tabii ki. Particularist'ten kastı bu anlamda aslında yani bütün gramer teorileri bunu sağlamaya çalışıyor. Particularist olmak yani teori ne olursa olsun bir dilin kategorilerini detaylı çözmedikçe bu landscape'i göremeyeceğini söylemek. Yani dili özel analiz, hani bizim önümüzdeki haftadan itibaren başlayacağımız şey, dönüp dolaşıp bununla ilgili bir şey söyleyeceği için bunu yapmak zorundasınız diyor ki burada da bence %100 haklı. Typology'ye da başka bir yer ayırmış. Diyor ki typology competence da değil de performance ile ilgili olduğu için bence extra grammatical diyor. Benim hissiyatım kategoriyel typology mümkün bence. Yani kategoriyel typology desek bu aslında competence ile ilgili bir şey. Çünkü biraz önceki mesela Cirbal'deki cross kategoriyel ilişkiler falan vardı ya. Ve işte olası referans pointlerini VP ergative, VP absolutive, IV ergative, IV absolutive gibi subcategorization'ları indirgeyebildiğimizde, eğer indirgeyebiliyorsak, yani particularist şey, universalist bir claim'e izin veriyorsa, o zaman bunlar gramatik, yani Cirbal'da gördüğümüz gibi gramatik iş yaptığı için niye performansla ilgili olsun ki? Competence olabilir. Yani çünkü şöyle cross categorial genellemeler gramatikalite ile ilgili bir şey söylüyorsa artık performans ötesine geçmiş demektir. Hatta yani performansın ötesine geçmişti. Türkçe'de enteresan oldu. Yani performansı halledip de competence'a girmedi. Competence level'ına çıktı anlamında demek lazım herhalde. Dolayısıyla yani ben Neumayer'in dil bilimciler şunlar odaklansın, typologistler de buna gibi iki ayrı dünya görüşüne katılmıyorum açıkçası. Bu bence yani lingüistik kategoriler bunları aynı dünyaya getirebilir. Daha doğrusu temelde şöyle bir prensip, yani competence ile performansın ne kadar arasını açarsanız o kadar dil bilimde competence çok böyle püritan bir şey dönüşüyor. Performance da çok böyle psychology'ye dönüşüyor. Halbuki ikisinin arasında başka bir şey var. Grammaticality ve meaningfulness. Dolayısıyla odak noktamız bu olursa Chomsky'nin çok haklı bir şekilde yaptığı competence performance distinction'ı daha kategoriyel düzeyde inceleyebiliriz aslında fikir bu fikir. Ki zaten Chomsky de bunu e, yani kendisini çıkarmadığını, aslında Saussure'ün bulduklarını devam ettirdiğini birkaç yerde söylüyordu galiba. Ee, Bu açıdan baktığımızda yani önümüzdeki haftada böyle satır ardını okumakta yardımcı olabilecek şeyleri düşünüyorum da o yüzden bu konulara biraz gireyim dedim bugün. Yani case assignment ile case use'un bir kategoriye baktığımızda bu case use, bu case assignment diyebilmek lazım. Ee, yani bu case use o tezlerden birisinin hani grammatical function diye, grammatical relation'ları bakalım, grammatical function bakalım diye işte biraz ona yaklaşık bir şey aslında. Mesela relative clause'ları düşünün. Orada enteresan oluyor. Videoda metin İngilizce, ben Türkçe konuşuyorum ama istiyorsanız İngilizce'de geçebilirim de. Nasıl yapayım?
Ben için fark etmez. Siz yani mesela video serseniz.
Let's try and make it more, unilingual in the videos. It's going to be fun watching this 10 years later. So if you look at the relative clause and try and find out whether this is case assignment or case use, there must be some categorical hints to be able to say this is case assignment, this is case use. So if you look at the head of a relative clause, typically in a language like English, the relative pronoun, in Turkish the relative participle. If you take this to be the relative pronoun, and if you follow the idea from yesterday that this is essentially a non-modifier, not an MP modifier, but non-modifier. And it modifies a noun and shares with it a common property of an argument taking place in two clauses, as the relative clause. So if this is the English category, if this is lambda p, this is the clause that is being relativized. This is the property that it relativized to, and eventually this will lead, by determiner, this will lead to that argument being an argument of another clause, like the book that you read belonged to Mary, and so the will take this and turn it into property sharing with belong and other matrix clauses. So this will be, these two are syntactic arguments, and this will be the thing that allows you to demonstrate the property of relativeness, so to speak, like px and qx kind of formulae, meaning this is an argument of both p and q, q being overall the result of the predicate that you get. So from this argument alone, you can see that this is case use because it's not basic. So that's the importance of basic verbal subcategorization, at least in this way of thinking. If it is not basic, then it's not a subcategorization. The implication is that this MP is already cased by P, this thing. So you're using the case that is assigned by something. About the book that John read, book gets the case from read.
Okay. So if you think of this as a relative clause, and if something is read, this is the object of reading. So that's why it's going to get its case from read,
And this is the reflection of that property. Okay.
Of course, the book is going to get another case from the matrix clause.
The book that John read belongs to Mary, but it doesn't have anything to do with the relative clause. It's about the book itself. Okay, so that's again the idea is just going back to the basics. If we're going to let only linguistic categories do the linguistic work, then there must be a way of differentiating case use from case assignment. So only verbs will assign case, meaning the subcategorizations will be basic, so that they can be considered first order. Okay. So that when you see a category like this, you can say, well, this must be case use because this is not basic. Which means these arguments will be already cased by these things, and you can see how this is going to be cased by read, by just analyzing John read. As we've done in a few weeks back. Clearly this is the transitive, right? And that's the whole point of the relative pronoun. And
This is NP, and when it's cased,
I should double this.
when you raise forward case, which I denoted like this, it's going to be S over S under NP, lambda P J prime, and it's going to compose with it to give you
S over NP. That's why it's cased by read. Okay. So John and read are cased by read. The book is further cased by the matrix clause because it's in two arguments. That part I'm going to sort of skip because you can just do it as an exercise later. But the idea is, again, keeping the focus on grammaticality being only categorially measurable. And then of course, okay, it's grammatical. What does it mean? Then we have this consequent sense placeholders unfolding themselves to say, but that's not what it means. Whatever, by category choice. So that's the idea. So, any questions about this derivation? Yeah. Okay. So I think verbs essentially are case assigners. You're going to see in some unexpected sources for case. Unexpected in the sense that it seems to be not coming from a verb. In Welsh, it's the infinitival, but some kind of infinitival seem to be subcategorizing for basic things. And in Basque, it's the auxiliary, which is nothing but the auxiliary. I mean, it's actually the only obligatory element. So they are still called auxiliaries, but I think it's kind of funny. So they are called auxiliary verbs, but when you look at them, they actually index all arguments of a verb, and there is no verbal inflection for that. It's all, everything is sitting on the auxiliary. So it's verbs and verb-like elements that at least I've been able to figure out in Welsh and Basque that are doing the case assignment work, and then the heads of constructions or adjuncts or whatever, I mean the constructions of the language are essentially case users. In other words, they so they're not, if they're not assigning case, then something else is assigning case, and they just use the case. This case could be as obvious as like the English case, a structural case, where you mark case by direction. Like to the right of the verb is the object, to the left it's the subject. It can be very specific, like the rational relative clauses. When you the relative pronoun of Russian are inflected for case. So if you relativize a genitive argument, the relative marker gets a genitive inflection. If it's an accusative, it gets an accusative inflection. Is it like Turkish, like do versus yan? Not quite the same, because Russian is very insistent on saying if it's ablative, mark it ablative. Whereas in Turkish, it's subject versus others kind of stuff. So it's so again, it just goes back to the idea of making a grammar so transparent that only the linguistic category is doing like construction, handling constructions, handling verb case assignment, handling whatever. By construction, I mean your typical inventory of things, relativization, coordination, control, ethic constructions, adjunction, whatever. Okay. So the reason why I'm sort of going over all this is because yesterday you've seen Jirbal taking this cross-categorical notion and putting it in a category as a head of a construction. As the head of, so the head of the control construction is sort of the control verb, but then the head of the relative clause is is something else. So let's I did on that part. I'm not. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, the relative clauses of Girbal are at 810, page 133. The relative marker is this thing is a suffix just like Turkish, except that it's got derivative and absolutive cases. But if you look at the category of that, it's a bit like what was it? It takes an ivy and about 10 years ago I used to write this as VP, and if you're asking me why not VP, that's the verbal morphology makes a difference. If you have the relative marker, it's in the morphologically it occupies the slot of the tense, so it's essentially untensed. That's why it's ivy. And that's why I think attention to detail in the verbal shape is so important in categorization. I thought so the argument is really in the detail. I mean, you could have, I like I said, I wrote VP for 10 years, and one day I look at verbal morphology of Girbal and find out that's actually not correct. I mentioned this because you're going to need this. This is going to give you another look when you read the chapters on your language about verbal morphology. And I suspect even the paradigmatic, when you look at these chapters, it's usually paradigmatic. So what do you get? Agreement, case, and stuff. But they don't mention relative markers because, after all, it's not part of the paradigm. It's just a construction. But then you go to chapter on relative clauses and say, oh, and it says something about morphology, and then you sort of connect the two and find out that's what. At least that's what I did for Girbal. Yeah. And the whole point of doing that, at least for me, was just let only the linguistic categories do all the work, rather than having a linking theory for grammatical relations and other theory for grammatical laws and stuff like this. So that's the whole idea. Okay, so I thought I'll go over that before I move on to other stuff. I think it's kind of fun to go back to Turkish and look at its relativization with this kind of stuff in mind. Because usually when we present things like this in paradigmatic verbal morphology, people say, I mean, they find it hard to believe that you can do, unbounded relativization with such a, complex morphology. Okay, so that's just point out that although this generalization has a cross-categorical basis, you put it when you put it in part of as part of a header for construction, like the control verb or the relative clause, then it becomes categorical. Okay? So in that sense, it does some linguistic work to the effect of affecting grammaticality. Okay, so that's what the Jirbal discussion yesterday reminded me of. So I thought I'll mention that. Any questions? Okay. But from this, of course, if again, just think about capturing linguistic diversity, including interlinguistic diversity and cross-linguistic diversity. So if you have VP, and VP is basic, unlike other categorical grammars, then if I have VP absolutive, what's stopping me from having VP ergative, or even VP accusative? Which seems to be the case for Icelandic. Why? Because some Icelandic verbs take accusative subject, which is called as Kirke subject. Yes. So these are not just logical possibilities. These are empirically attested options for categorical diversity. And of course, VP norm is your standard accusative language kind of VP. And this bare VP seems to be the necessity for Tagalog. This is relevant for Icelandic. Obviously, this is like Latin. This will be relevant to Inuit. And this is, we have already seen, to be relevant to Jirbal. Okay. So, of course, since VPs are essentially infinitival forms, and there is usually an infinitival operator in a language, like English to, Turkish mak, that appears to be, in Jirbal, something like a purposive marker. In Icelandic there is infinitival. So there's going to be IV correlates of this. And the Icelandic case is very interesting. I'm not going to go into detail, but in Icelandic, if the verb is in the root form, there is no Kirke case. It can take anything, which is quite interesting. Because the root form they use for root is different than the VP form, which is IV nominative and IV. This is almost like the VP case without any case restriction. It's almost like, well, just give me anything as long as it's a VP. And that seems to be what Tagalog is doing, at least as far as I can tell. So essentially these are the sort of toolboxes for writing subcategorizations, and these are the and they're and you can, when you see these basic categories, then you can sort of see that this is actually a case assignment. When you see things with slash, like then you can see it might be case use or something else. But this is not a case assignment, just because, I mean, it's a one-way implication. That's something to keep in mind. I mean, it's important to be a verb. This is basic subcategorization. but that doesn't mean the relative marker is a case assigner, because it's part of speech, is not a verb. So the verbal morphology, I mean, I take it literally. It's morphology. It's a part of speech that makes a difference, especially in Welsh as well, because the infinitival that assigns case has a different form than the root form. Okay. So actually, in this kind of finding the category, I call it category games in a language. So finding the connection between categories is it really takes a closer look into verbal morphology and the position of the head of constructions in the verbal paradigm to see whether they are targeting finite forms or finite clauses, infinitival clauses, or root clauses. And you can see that in Turkish, ben kitabı okumak istiyorum is fine. Ben kitabı oku istiyorum is something else. It's an imperative, right? I mean, the root form of a subordinate clause in root form is different, right? I mean, the clausal force is not the same. In fact, it's not even ben kitabı oku istiyorum, ben kitabı okumak istiyorum. What's your gut feeling? It doesn't mean the same. I mean, the first one is almost imperative, right?
First just strikes you, but yeah.
Ben kitabı oku istiyorum.
Can we say that?
I think so.
You can.
As an imperative only. Or what? It's not really, yeah. Sometimes it's required. I mean, bu filmi seyretmek kimseye yaramadı. Bu filmi seyret, kimseye yaramadı. It just doesn't work. I mean, it's bad for me. Is it saying? Okay. I was going to go into Balinese, but maybe you just need a 10-minute break and then I'll. Yeah. So with these kind of possibilities in mind, I was going to go over Balinese, but we're sort of. I just want to get to Turkish today for some reason. So shall we just skip Balinese and do it later and look at Turkish? Yeah, I'm changing my plans in the course of the lecture, but that's okay, I guess. 194. Yeah. So I'm just first report the basics. I mean, if you look at 11, this one is about control and it's about Mach actually. So the çocuk adamı çalışmaya ikna etti. And if you look at A and B, the only difference is essentially having intransitive or transitive, and in either case, Turkish controls the subject, the A rather than P or S. So essentially, the control is accusative in Turkish. That's not much of a surprise, but it allows you to write categories like 11.2, B, like so like persuade takes a VP, which is a funny kind of VP because it's got K's on it. Because at least in my Turkish, you can't say çocuk adamı kitabı okumaya ikna etti. That's just bad, right? Yeah. But the fun. I was going to. But we're not talking about control, so let's go to relativization. That's just the next section. So, jump again, some typical facts from Turkish at 11.9, page 198. So if you're relativizing the subject, it's kediyi okşayan misafir, not kediyi okşadığı misafir. When you have dık relativization, you get agreement with it, so that you get misafirin okşadığı kedi, not misafirin okşayan kedi is just bad. So there is a very interesting categorical asymmetry, and the discussion is like, what is this asymmetry based on? Morphology, case, whatever. But again, just for pointers for next week. So if you look at next verbal categorization 11.10, the root forms are onto IV, and the infinitival forms are into VP, like 11.11. And the only difference, of course, is MUC. The MUC does that. So the way I formulate it is it's MUC that turns an IV into VP. And as a start, I said, just to compare the relative clause of Girbal, let me just put the relative clause of Girbal and then English relative pronoun. And I tend to write this with S over MP. Because of what is called a dat T trace. So if you relativize an object, I mean, if the relative clause has the relative pronoun that, the common understanding is that you cannot relativize a subject long distance in English. Although apparently this is changing. Because if you look at this as a domain, this relative pronoun is targeting the object, S over MP, not S under MP. So why not both subject and object is an interesting question. So this is, it's called the dat T trace effect in English. No. This effect is highlighting the fact that there's an asymmetry in object and subject relativization in English, if there's that in the expression. So the book let me minimize number of that so that so you can say the book I believe that Miro read is okay, meaning you're essentially relativizing long distance. Why? Because red is an argument of belief, and just book hops on two clauses. And what it's called long distance because it's an argument of read, but it's not an argument of believe. So it hops over believe. That's correct. It's called long range. And the intention is that I believe that Mary read means I believe that Mary read the book. It's just that you're relativizing the book. So this is the gap. So this is necessarily transitive read. And this is that T trace. The man, I believe, that read the book. Is apparently bad in English. In other words, this subject hopping over because of this and that, it's ungrammatical. Yeah. It seems like there's a difference of opinion on this, but that tree effect has been discussed in the linguistic literature for so long, for like 20 years. It was like one of the grand achievements of asymmetry, the first asymmetry that people noticed, like subject-object asymmetry. So it was, I think, at least historically, it's an important discussion. So, I mean, with that in mind, I just wrote S over MP rather than any any directionality. Which is funny because if the relative pronoun is missing, which is very common in English, spoken English at least. The man I believe read the book. With the proper I can't do the right intonation. I'm not native, but you can without it seems to be okay. If you've got the right intonation, I can't do that. The man I believe read the book, or something like that maybe. Yeah, I can. We need a native speaker for that. So why am I saying so? Yeah, just compare this with 1114, the Turkish relative markers. So again, you see case use in two different realizations. So yan is like looking for ivy, and just like Cirbal, if you look at duk in Turkish, in terms of morphological template, it's in the duk is in the morphological slot where tense would be. So if you, that's why I was quite careful with 11.9's glossing. Look at 11.19b. Misafirin okşadığı kedi. That actually means 11.9. Yeah, it's on page 198. So 11.9 to me is either the cat that the guest pets or petted, or is petting. Is that also okay for you? Same for you? So it just shows that duk is actually in the position of tense, so that when tense is gone, you're free to interpret any way you like it in terms of temporal sort of span. So that's why I said, okay, this must be IV for Turkish, at least in this formulation. Duk is looks more like a case user, because after all, S under MP is not a basic category. And then I write the same relative clause formulae for sharing an argument across two clauses. No, there are some. But it, again, just reading between the lines in these categories for heads of construction. So I'm essentially saying the head of the relative clause construction in Turkish is yan or dık because it determines the semantics of the construction. That's the claim. Well, that's not my claim. Everybody says that. Is just I, I write an explicit category for it. And this is got, and I take it to be an MP modifier. Why not? And could be actually. I mean, what's the difference between an and MP in Turkish? I'm not. It's not really clear to me. But one of the reasons why I said MP is because things like misafirin what is the I mean there's an accusative sitting here. It's kind of an interesting question whether does it attach to a noun or a noun phrase is I mean if you look at intonation in Turkish like misafir okşadığı kediyi gören olmamış intonation is almost like this which is pretty much the semantic scope of the case marker actually. But some people take it to be just kedi. Then if you assign a case to this, then what do you do with the relative clause? Is an interesting question. So I don't know whether, I mean it's not clear whether Turkish has MP versus N distinction. Well obviously we have her kitap okunmaz probably. That sounds like an MP. Right? Whereas iyi kitap okunur. This could be MP or N, it doesn't matter, right? Because I can have her iyi kitap. So if her takes, if this is a quantifier and a determiner, then you would expect it to be NP over N. But if that's the case, then this must be N as well for this to work, right? So I'm not, I don't, when it comes to quantification, I'm a bit lost. So because it's a, I always wondered why actually, but it says, I mean, when you look at quantification data, it's more about number of readings rather than grammaticality. So it's, I don't know how much of that relates to grammaticality. So I'm tempted to write Turkish relative clauses, relative markers as MP modifiers. But I mean, it could be N. And so many languages, you know, make the distinction between MP and N, like these Wakashan languages and others. So I don't know. If you put the case on just kedi, then this will be an adjunction to that kitty, perhaps. Or maybe complementation like Gülşat project kind, and then that's gonna be the argument of Görbek. But anyway, so the category is essentially non-modifier, looking for an argument. And if you look at the argument in 1114, in page 200, it says S under MP. Just give me give me a clause with agreement. So because DUC requires agreement. But MP can be anything. Look, there is no restriction on case. And that you can see in like 1116. Adam köpekten korkar. So korkmak in Turkish takes an ablative. Right? It's not like English fear. English fear is funny because it can take accusative or others. In Turkish, I think, right, it has to be ablative, right? I mean, adam köpeği korktu olmaz. It's just bad. Köpeğe korktu, just. But if you look at the relativizer, adamın korktuğu köpek barınağa konmuş. It's just like, so it's not, so the DUC is not really singling out any case. So that's why there is no case restriction on 1114. That might come in handy when you look at your own languages. And I think Balkız Hoca actually was one of the first to argue that Turkish relativizers do not single out grammatical roles. I think she had a paper on that. Yeah. Could be a direct object, could be dative, whatever. As long as it's got agreement, it's essentially fine. I'll skip the incorporation examples. I think these are really fun to just think about them, like kamyon çarpan köpek. Why is it relativizing with an when köpek is actually an object? So that's another, I think, like arı sokan çocuk, kamyon çarpan köpek. That's very, yeah. Kamyon çarptı köpek. Kamyonun çarptığı köpek is fine, of course, but kamyon çarpan köpek is also, you know.
I guess there was something with the subject there, like the referentiality of the.
Yeah.
Was it just the hay? I think he had a piece on that. When it becomes when we attach genitive, I think the subject
Yeah.
becomes referential. If you say arının soktuğu çocuk.
It's incorporated. Yeah. I think Engin says that. That's what Engin Sezer said. Yeah. Yeah. If it's incorporated, actually, kamyon çarpan köpek is. It's difficult to see the ambiguity, but arı sokan kız, it's much easier to see the ambiguity. Maybe the girl stung the bee, or the bee stung the girl. So it's, yeah. So I think that's Engin Sezer who showed that it's actually ambiguous. Yeah. And then, of course, with DUC, if you look at the unbounded relatives in Turkish, like the one on top of page 206, benim kitabı okuduğunu bildiğim adam. So the man is reading the book and just hops on two clauses. So The duk on oku is a complementizer, not the relative marker. The one on bil is the relative marker. So that's, I don't know how you do it in dependency, but that's how we do it. Yeah. There is another variant of this. Benim kitabı okuyan olduğunu bildiğim adam. How is that for you? Benim kitabı okuyan olduğunu bildiğim adam.
Yeah, it's fine.
Benim kitabı okuyan olduğunu bildiğim adam çok zenginmiş.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have yan, there's all duk. That's sort of, that shows that it's actually, it's not the duk on oku is not the relative marker. It's actually complementizer. Yeah. And just going back to Balkız's point, if you look at E, I am relativizing the subject, embedded subject. Benim kitabı okuduğunu bildiğim adam is relativizing the subject. If you look at the next example on top of page 207, benim adamın okuduğunu bildiğim kitap. I am relativizing the object with the same strategy, so it really doesn't have a lot to do with grammatical roles. Okay. This is kind of fun stuff, and you can read the rest of the chapter yourself if you feel like it. It might help, because this is essentially data that you can most directly relate to. It might help you with the analysis of the languages that you're going to study. Because I get into coordination, and if you get into coordination in Turkish, of course, the most interesting problem is the suspended chord affixation, which is, a beast by itself. But I'm not going to get into that. I don't think we need to get into too much detail on that. I'm just, my point, at least for today, is I say, so if you look at the labeling of 1114 on page 200, the standard terminology is subject participle versus object participle. SP, OP is not, it's not my terminology, it's the standard from the literature. But if Balkız Hoca is right, and if these categories are right, then object participle essentially is not the proper description of what is happening. It's not just the object. So I sort of renamed it at 206 as bare participle and agreement participle, because that's all duk does. If you get agreement with duk, then it has to agree with the subject, and yan can never agree with the subject, and that seems to be the only difference. So that's essentially, and you can see that this is actually both categories in 1122 on page 206 are essentially case uses. Why? Because yan is not a case assigner. So although its argument is basic, yan itself is not a verb. So the condition is not, having a basic category is not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient to be case assigner. You have to be a verb. And duk is more obviously case user, because all the categories are essentially complex categories. So that's you sort of across the board category distinction to make the distinction between to capture the asymmetry in constructions. And I think this might be relevant to what you're going to be seeing at, you know, Ao and also Mamanda. They just glimpsed over their relative clauses that look like, you know, sort of familiar from somewhere. Yeah. Any how about let's do an ablative long distance. That's really long distance. Benim senin adamın korktuğunu bildiğini sandım köpek. That's so. I mean, when you present examples like these in linguistic journals, that most, if the referee is not native, they're just blown away by these data. Right, this is I am doing because thinking, you're doing the knowing, and the man is doing the fearing, and what is feared is way extracted over 3 clauses. Is that okay for you? Benim senin adam korktuğunu bildiğini sandım köpek. Eğer bizim yan mahallede oturuyormuş.
Have to do my. I mean, I cannot do.
Yeah, this is too much embedding, right? But it's yeah, and it's been we've been talking for 2 hours. That's it's just like you got the cycle, yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's really clear to me at least that this is the relative marker. So these will be complementizers, and relativization in Turkish is really unbounded, and which is quite amazing because it hasn't got much attention in the literature. I'm deliberately using different persons for subjects because there's the most morphological effect. If they're all same, like third persons, it's a bit difficult psychologically. Yani Ayşe'nin Mehmet'in adamın korktuğunu bildiği sandığı köpek, it's a bit difficult to trace, right? If everything is third person, it's too much. Same morphology, right? I mean, if you do it like Ayşe'nin Mehmet'in adamın korktuğunu bildiği sandığı köpek, it's just, it's a bit difficult for more difficult than this. So how would you, maybe for the benefit of the video, I should probably close it. At least the meaning, I'm not gonna. Or maybe I should, I don't know. I would say this I, first person singular, you, second person singular, man, 3s, and notice that I'm not writing genitive because there is no genitive semantics. This is another point of departure for many people. I'm sorry, I resisted, temptation to write genitive. So fear, complementizer, 3s, no, like 3s, like man, fear, man is fearing, no, that's you, no, complementizer, 2s,
Plus
think, consider, believe.
case hocam.
Right. Maybe. No. And then this one. Is this some think or consider or believe? What do you think?
Think gibi sanki.
Yeah. Think relativizer. First person. Therefore, everyone works out between. So there's a difference between complement subordinate clauses agreeing and relative clause agreeing. So again, just for the benefit of the video, the dog that I think you know
The men fear.
right. We got into English that trace problem. So the man feared is fearing is okay. Feared is fearing okay.
Fears.
Yeah. Again, it seems like it's occupying the slot of the tense. So your tense is free. There's room for some psycholinguistics here, but I'm not the right person to do it. I mean, if you do this experiment, do these kind of judgments with same persons or with agreeing subjects, it's really difficult. Right. In fact, some people find it ungrammatical. Ayşe'nin Mehmet'in adamın korktuğunu bildiğini sandığı kitap. Köpek is it okay for you? I think I see a master's thesis right there. Maybe we should talk to Inji Hoca about this. We need a psycholinguist for this. I don't think I can do this experiment. So my point is, just going back to the discussion, it's essentially if the category is something like this with some kind of agreement, then it's pretty just this is for Duk. Compare this with Jan category. I mean any it's quite obvious that any clause that's going to give S under MP can be target of relativization. So it can be in principle unbounded because of this. But this has to be bounded because IV is not, you can't compose over IV. So again, we're just trying to explain boundedness and unboundedness through difference in their difference in the head of constructions. So this is unbounded. This is bounded. That's the sort of implication. Because of the difference between these two. Now this is the kind of stuff you tend to get in your native language. I wouldn't expect things like this in reporting in the thesis. Unbounded relativization, it's been hardly looked at all, especially if it's the first description of the language for publication. You don't see a lot of material for figuring out whether relativization in that language is bounded or unbounded. It's sometimes you do, but it's rare. But it's kind of fun looking up for this data. I mean, if you know what you're looking for, then you know the kind of data that you need in that language. That's nice. Okay, I hope this is going to give you some, at least idea about, going from description to categorization, and we'll start doing that next week. First, the description, I think, just very informal. Let's get the feeling of the language, morphology, and then we'll try and move towards constructions and look first the verbs in detail and then to constructions. Typically they always cover relativization, and if there is something else covered, it's usually control. That's what I've noticed. And there's always something about coordination. And there you have to be careful, because what they mean by coordination may not be true coordination all the time. Subordinating conjunction is very difficult to sort of differentiate from true coordination, so that's something to watch out for. So in English, when you say John likes and Mary hates cats, it's essentially coordination, because you can swap the order of coordinates and mean the same. That's the semantics of coordination. But if you say John bought a beer and drank it, you can say John drank it and bought a beer to mean the same. So it's actually subordinating conjunction. But it's and the coordinator, so that's difficult to figure out. My usual test for coordination is, can you swap the order of arguments and mean the same? If you can do that, then it's true coordination. Same problem in Turkish, of course.
So this might get tricky if they drop the object, I think that.
Right. Yeah.
This object is broken.
Yeah.
That it will be silent, so you don't know if it is shared or dropped.
Yeah.
One of them.
Yeah, it's but usually, I mean, it's relativization. Everybody does. Control, most theses get into it. Coordination, they cover it. But if you have a closer look on coordinations, most of them are subordinating conjunctions. So, for instance, in Inuit, there is one very influential book forgot the name of the author. Sorry. There's only there's so many different kinds of coordination in Inuit depending on the voice, mood of the verb. And he says it's true coordination only in volitive mood. And he goes into great detail to explain that actually. So that's kind of nice. I forgot. I think it was Western Eskimo book. West Greenlandic. So I guess this is it for the day. Let me just stop this.